Hello, my name's Kristen, and I'm an artist and illustrator in McCarthy, Alaska, and today I wanted to show you my approach to winter sketching. It's March 30th, and it's still cold out. It's 26 degrees in the shade, but it's quite warm and sunny everywhere else. So we'll head down the trail with my dog Jack. This is my morning walk that we do pretty much every day. It starts out in the cottonwood forest and then it goes into the spruce forest. I see lots of different animal tracks. There's been a lot of snowshoe hares recently. Um, and then eventually you go up a little hill and come out to this clearing that's on a river bluff, which is a sit spot that I like to sometimes hang out at and return to day after day just to spend some time listening, observing, and making journal entries. It's fun to have this quiet place to come back to. This spot has some nice southern exposure, so right now it's sunny and it looks out over the river, which is kind of cool because the river changes a lot based on how it melts and freezes. And it's nice just to sit and listen and be still after walking through the forest. This is the sketchbook that I like to use in the winter. I like to keep things simple and use non-freezing materials. So I have a little Write in the Rain binder with Write in the Rain paper, some colored pencils, and a pencil. I use this notebook to make simple notes and quick sketches. I also take photos while I'm walking, so I'll show you some of the photos I took while I was walking through the forest of things that caught my eye or interested me. When I sat down at my sit spot, I actually started with a prompt that I learned in a wilderness mental health first aid class. It's a grounding exercise where you think of and list out 5 things you see, 4 things you hear, 3 things you feel, 2 things that you smell, and 1 thing that you taste. While I sat and listened, I heard a really quiet kind of ka-flump of the snow collapsing near me. I heard the river gurgle, and then there was a really loud squirrel in the spruce trees that were kind of over to my left, and then a bird that flew past and made some calls. And what I like to do with sound is kind of come up with little marks or symbols that represent those sounds, and I drew a little sound map. Once I finished the grounding exercise, I got up and went over to investigate some of the willows that were growing near me. You can't really tell from this shot, but I was about knee-deep in snow, and the snow was falling in my boots, so I didn't want to spend a ton of time there. But I made some diagrams and took some notes and asked some questions about the willows that I was looking at. I also collected a few willow branches to take home with me, and then it was time to walk home. As I walked, and then when I got back to the cabin, I thought about what I wanted to sketch later. I'm curious about willows and how some are more white and fuzzy than others. I also noticed that the willows I was looking at are more white and fuzzy towards the tips of the branches than lower down. That night, I came back to my sketchbook and I took out a microscope that I have that attaches to an old iPad and looked at the willow branches that I collected more closely. So I was able to zoom in and photograph some of the buds under about 20 times magnification. And I decided I was going to use those photos and the willow specimens to make a sketch. In the winter we have really long nights, so it's nice to kind of have this time and work at my desk with watercolor and other materials. So I started by tracing the willow branch I brought home to mark kind of where the different buds were on the branch. And then looking at it carefully, I drew that out in pencil. Then I looked at the magnifications and roughly sketched out 3 different views from 3 different vantages on the willow branch. So one at the tip, one kind of more towards the bottom, and then one in the middle where that interesting bud had gotten eaten. I had a rough pencil sketch. I went back over my lines with pen, kind of refining my shapes and adding a little bit more detail to where the edges were furry. And then once the pen was dry, I erased the pencil and came back in with a brush pen to add a little bit more contrast to some places. For example, I would make a thicker line on the side of the branch that would be in shadow, or make a thicker line on a part that I wanted to stand out and come forward. This is a pretty personal decision, but I like to use the thicker lines to add some contrast and visual interest. Once I finished that, I switched pens again and wrote down some notes and questions that I had. And then it was time to watercolor. So with watercolor, I want to work from light to dark. And one thing that I really wanted to capture in these willows is that sense that they are growing and that it's almost springtime, or it is springtime. So I really wanted to get that feeling of the green and some of the reds that you see kind of in between the browns. So to get some of the green color, I mixed up a quinacridone gold with a little bit of sap green, and I started with that layer since I wanted to make sure it came through, and then added some brown as a raw sienna in a wash around it. Then I mixed up some more kind of purpley grays and added those in to some of the willow bud areas and to deepen some of the shadows and start to make the branches feel a little bit more round. Again, I also really wanted to capture that orangey red color. It's a little bit hard because green and red are complements. So together they'll make black, and I want this to feel vibrant, not gray. So I have to be a little bit mindful about not putting the red right on top of the green, but I mixed up, again, the quinacridone gold with some quinacridone rose to make kind of like a warm orange color, and put that in a few places, including on the little bud that we zoomed into. I want to come back and add some white fur to these branches, since that's something that I'm really interested in for the sketch. It's kind of how that pattern changes throughout. And one thing that will make the white stand out if I come back and add it on later with gouache or as an opaque white is to have some darkness for that to go up against or show up against. So I do want to make sure that I build up the darks in some places. I also wanted to find some of the lights, like in that little tuft coming out of the broken bud, and just add some shadows and variation in color. Then I also am more focused on those places where I zoomed in, but I don't want to forget about my actual willow branch that's drawn to scale, at 100% scale. So I want to paint that in. I want to make sure I capture about how it gets darker at the bottom and then lighter and furrier towards the top. The colors that I'm using are the quinacridones, gold and rose, to get some of those warmer hues, a little bit of sap green where it's greenish, and then a lot of burnt sienna and raw sienna to get some of the browns. You can mix your own brown, but it's quicker, sometimes easier just to have them already mixed in your palette. And then I really like using a variety of different blues to get kind of different levels of shadow. So I'll use an indanthrone blue where I want it to get really dark and kind of that deep purple color. And then I might use a cobalt turquoise where I'm just looking for a lighter shadow or a little bit of depth. I use my water brush for most of this painting because that's what I usually use in the field, but I also carry this tiny little bristle travel brush with me, so I'm going to switch over to that to get some of these fine details and add in some white. I'm going to use some white gouache for that. So I'll define some of the furry areas and highlights, and then I'm going to do the same thing but with a darker color, so again mixing kind of my raw sienna with indanthrone blue and building up a dark brown to add in some shadows and details with my little brush. And I just find that painting with this small brush gives me a little bit more control and gets a finer line than with the water brush. So I keep switching through my reference photos so that I have those to work from. And I'll just add a little bit more to the main branch and finally come back in with my pen, see if there are any other details that I want to add or things that I want to define now that I've painted on here. So I like to go over some of the textures, like the furry texture on the buds. One thing that makes something come forward or pop in a sketch is having a light next to a dark. So in the places where I have the little white marks coming in with some pen next to that will really make it pop and come forward. Here you can see the finished sketch up close. Thanks for joining me today, and I hope you enjoyed this little bit of insight into my winter sketching process.